Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this BSI Built Environment webinar on BS 40104, the new code of practice for retrofit assessment in domestic dwellings. My name is Colin McCarricker. I'm a lead standards development manager here at BSI, and I'm the committee manager for CB 401, the committee that's developing the standard. Okay, next slide, please. Well, here we go. So here's the agenda for today. We're very lucky to have with us experts from the committee and panel. We have Peter Rickaby, former chair of the Retrofit Standards Task Group, who's going to give us an overview of the standards framework. Richard Fitton, who's a professor of building performance at the University of Salford and chair of the BS 40104 drafting panel, who's going to give us an overview of the standard. Jan Williams from Historic England, who's the Risk and Regulations Heritage Surveyor there, who's going to give us a take on the heritage sector. And Andrew Parkin from Elmhurst Energy and the Property Energy Professionals Association, who's going to tell us about managing compliance with the new standard. Next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This is a listen-only webinar. It's being recorded, and all delegates will be sent a copy of the recording once the webinar finishes. We very much welcome your questions in the Q&A, so please put them into the Q&A function, and we'll collect those and put them to the panelists once we've heard from them. Next slide, please. Okay, that's me. I've introduced myself. Next slide. Okay, so BS 40104, a standard for retrofit assessment in domestic dwellings. It was always planned as part of the retrofit standards framework, which Peter's going to tell you about in a bit. And it expands on the principles embodied in PAS 2035-2023. And in the future revisions of the standard of the PAS, the standard will be normatively referenced, and so the methodology for assessment will be that in the new standard. It gives a thorough methodology for retrofit assessment. It aims to enhance quality and create a common approach, and of course it comes with very much the intended aim of improving retrofitting outcomes. So next slide, please. And one of the main messages we want to give today is that standards development is an inclusive and transparent process, and we very much welcome your contribution to the development of the standard by responding to the public consultation, which will open around the 20th of May and will run until about the 20th of July this year. So please follow this link and please give us your comments on the draft. And Richard and the drafting panel will review those and take in those they feel relevant into producing the final version of the standard. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is the link. Public consultation runs from May to July 2024. Please come back to this link. We'll give it again at the end of the webinar. Please come back to this link, and if you have any further questions, contact me. Next slide, please. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get on to the people that you really want to hear from. And I'd like to introduce first Dr. Peter Rickaby, former chair of the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group and honorary senior research fellow at University College London, who has been key to the creation of the PASs and standards for retrofit that came out of the Each Home Counts review. So I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Colin. I hope everybody can hear me. Good morning, everyone. If you take us on to the next slide, please. So BS 40104, the assessment standard, is going to be part of the BSI Retrofit Standards framework when it's finished. And so my task this morning is just to explain a little bit about where the framework came from and why it's an important feature of our set of PAS, etc. standards for retrofit. So actually the framework came out of the Each Home Counts review. The quality and standards recommendations 8, 9 and 10 are here on the screen. And as you can see from number 9, it says establish a retrofit standards task group which we did in 2016. And that task group is still working today on building a framework and a complete set of retrofit standards. Recommendation 8 said, build that framework. I will come to that in a minute. And recommendation 10 asked us to commission a research project, so we understood what existing standards already existed, what standards already existed for retrofit. The Retrofit Standards Task Group commissioned that work from National Energy Foundation around 2016, and that work was completed about a year or so later and has been the main tool which the Retrofit Standards Task Group and more recently Committee CB 401 have used to build this framework of retrofit standards. So next slide, please. So this is the first version of the BSI Retrofit Standards Framework built in response to those each home counts review recommendations. At the top, you see the each home counts features. In the middle, the each home counts quality mark, which became trust mark, and supported by the each home counts code of conduct to try and keep contractors and installers in line, and the customer charter to let customers of retrofit know what they should and should not expect. Those were both written by Liz Mail, and they've been absorbed by Trustmark into the Trustmark process. When particularly a publicly funded retrofit program is required to be subject to Trustmark, then Trustmark requires compliance with what was originally called the Each Home Counts Code of Practice, which is in fact past 2035, which I'm sure very many of you are familiar with, if not all of you. However, below there on the diagram, you see 3 more boxes. The first one on the left is existing BSI standards. The one on the right is non-BSI standards, and those are referred to and by past 2035, which requires compliance with them. So existing BSI standards referred to by past 2035 with which compliance is required include past 2030, BS 5250, BS 7913, and several others. And the non-BSI standards include the insulation industry standards, the MCS standards, and 1 or 2 from CIBSE. In the middle is the key box for this session. The Retrofit Standards Task Group and Committee CB 401 are continuing to work on new standards to be put into the framework. We've already had the Building Performance Evaluation Standard, BS 40101. We're now looking at today BS 40104, an assessment, and there are other standards in the pipeline, including thermal comfort and IAQ, ventilation and air tightness, and so on. The idea is that the new standards in the middle box, in the bottom row, will eventually supplant or replace the relevant clauses of past 2035. In this case, it would be clause 7 of past 2035, which is the assessment clause, which at some point in the 2-year revision cycle of past 2035 will be replaced by BS 40104. But Richard will have more to say about that process a little bit later. My main point, though, about this framework is that it is a mechanism for making sure that when a retrofit program is launched and subject to standards and Trustmark, that all relevant standards are brought to bear. Trustmark requires compliance with past 2035. Past 2035 requires compliance with the other standards in the bottom boxes, and the bottom boxes will continue to expand as we fill in more titles in the middle there. So it's a mechanism for making sure that we don't overlook standards and that all the relevant ones do comply, are brought to bear. Next slide, please. This is my final slide, and just to show you the current version of the standards framework, which looks a lot like the last one, except that we've slotted in past 2038, the non-domestic standard. Past 2038 was commissioned by what was then BEIS, now DESNES, in 2021, and applies obviously to non-domestic buildings, but we slotted it into the framework because it also refers to and requires compliance with most of the standards in the boxes on the bottom row. It's not subject to Trustmark or the Code of Conduct or the Customer Charter, but it does connect into the framework for the same reason of making sure that all relevant standards are brought to bear even on non-domestic retrofit projects. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say, just to give you a feel for why we talk about the framework and how BS 40104 fits in. So I'll hand back now to Colin.
Thanks very much, Peter, for that overview. It's good to see how the standards journey has progressed and how our standards fit in with those developed elsewhere. I'd like now to hand over to Richard Fitton, who's Professor of Building Performance at the University of Salford, where he's technical lead for the Energy Building Physics Lab in the Energy House 2 project. And he's also chair of the BS 40104 drafting panel, so it's he and his colleagues have been doing all the hard work getting the draft ready for public consultation. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Colin. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a bit about what I do, just to set some context. I look after Energy House Labs here at the University of Salford, where we test buildings, test materials, work with smart meters and test building physics projects. So that's kind of my background. Next slide. This won't be, I am an academic. I've been an academic for about a dozen years, but prior to that, I'm a chartered building surveyor. I've done lots of work around energy assessment. I've spent many years in housing, and I've been on the ground doing EPCs and condition surveys and things like that. So hopefully I've got a kind of decent background in that area as well. So this isn't a purely academic piece of work by anyone's standards. Next slide, please. So I guess with all retrofit, we're expected to start our set of slides and our presentations with some kind of disaster around retrofit, and that's quite disheartening to a lot of people who do it well. Retrofit has gone wrong in the past, but we can get it right, and a lot of it's gone right in the past as well, and often we forget about that. So I have a slightly more positive spin on the retrofit marketplace, if you like, and I'm a massive believer in kind of getting it right for the public good as well. So we won't be having any retrofit disasters in this set of slides. So if you're expecting some, then please leave now. Next slide. So there's just one. I couldn't help but put this one in that someone sent me a few years ago, actually now. So this is the installation of an air conditioning system that's maybe done to meet someone's very specific requirements around either heating or cooling, but it strikes me as a bit of a retrofit disaster in itself. And I think we can judge that by the fact there's still a fan at the end of the bed there, probably helping to keep the building cool. So just a bit of a light-hearted touch there. It's nothing about retrofit in the UK, which I am a huge fan of. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to labour past 2035. I think most of us know what it is. Peter's done a really good introduction to it. And you know, I look to Peter to give any expert guidance around 2035. But as we should all be aware, then all publicly funded retrofit should be covered by past 2035. Now, this standard that I'm going to discuss does link perfectly with past 2035, as you would expect, and it's going to sit into Peter's framework there that he discussed. However, and this is a really important however, we as a committee and a group, we sat and designed this standard from scratch, obviously taking in the input from past 2035. But this standard can be used for any retrofit assessment project that anyone wishes to use it for. Yes, it obviously fits in with 2035, but it will be used, hopefully, by different projects. And as someone who's skilled in this sector as a retrofit assessor, then I'd be delighted if people took this standard, and we believe it's a really high quality standard, and started to use it for any retrofit assessment projects, whatever they may be. So just keep that in mind. Really, it does link to 2035, but it's not, you know, it's not mutually exclusive to 2035 by anyone's standard. So please do see what else this standard can be used for. And I think, and as a panel of experts, we'd be really interested in hearing what people might use this for as well. Next slide, please. This is the title of the standard 40104. The only good thing about that number is it can be used the same forwards as backwards. That's about it. It's quite a long number, but that's how I remember it. 40104, and it is retrofit assessment process for domestic properties. Okay, next slide, please. So as I've said, the role is mentioned in 2035. This isn't a new role. Okay, retrofit assessor isn't a new role. The basics have been laid down in the existing standard. I've had many discussions with people who tell me that retrofit assessment as it stands now is varied. And I suppose that's as much as I'm prepared to say. It's varied. Some people are doing it better than others. There's a need, and the text of 2035 even states there is a need to provide a full standard to assessment to deliver high quality assessments. So the figures behind assessment are disputed because everyone records in different ways for different funding and things like this. But there's several 100,000 assessments being done. So we need to make sure that we get it right, because I anticipate that this will ramp up, hopefully, as we maybe take a more strategic view to retrofit in the UK, hopefully over the next few years. Next slide, please. So how do I kind of sum up retrofit? So I'm a building surveyor. That's always been my trade, if you like. But I've also worked around energy for many, many years, including EPC assessments and all the other kind of stuff. So I see, in a basic point of view, it's where the damp meter meets the energy assessment. Okay, this is looking at both camps. Why has it not been done before? Many people ask, and I can't give a suitable answer. But the fact is, it's been done now. So this is it. This is where we look at condition and we look at defects and pathology hand in hand with energy, with a view to getting retrofit right. Next slide, please. So the panel, the chair is me, and we have a very well selected panel from industry and academia and not-for-profit. Next slide, please. So here's our list of people that's on the panel. It's well represented from heritage, from industry, from design, from the client side, from the product manufacturers, and everyone else. 12 is quite a large panel, but it works well together, and we don't think that we have many omissions from that panel. Okay, next slide, please. So this is where we're going to get into the meat of what retrofit assessment is. There's 8 key areas. Next slide. So the first one is context. The second that we forget about the context of a building, in terms of retrofit, that's when we can start to see it go wrong. This has happened many times before. So we look at many things in context. We look at the dwelling shape, the size, the structure, the services that that are available on the site, the suitability of that building for improvement is all kind of wrapped up in those. We also kind of look at the constraints offered by the site. So it might be that there's a long and winding track to this small kind of dwelling, up a farm track, something like that. That makes a big difference when you're trying to organise for things to get to that site. It might be that they're back-to-back terraces with only a small passageway and things like this. There's lots and lots of things that can be applicable to a building that's not related to defects or energy. So Joanne's going to talk about the historical aspects and heritage aspects. But if we look at even things like statutory limitations, right to light, party wall issues, tree preservation orders, access to site, as I mentioned before, orientation of the building, overshading, exposure levels, there's a heck of a lot of data that we need to kind of collect now as part of this assessment before really we've even set foot in the building. So and that is a long and well developed list. Next slide. Condition. So I think that condition is one of the things that maybe as an energy assessor or someone in this kind of marketplace might not have dealt with a lot before. Some of us will, some of us won't. This is the new part, if you like, in terms of the retrofit process. And we really need to look for defects. We're not in the game here of analysing defects and carrying out deep building pathology studies. We need to know the location and severity of defects, whether they're structural, cracks in building, condensation, damp, mold growth issues. We need an idea of the level of condition of all those elements. Some things might be in good condition, others will not. That even extends in 40104 to things like the surfaces, the lighting, the hot water. Now, this isn't a very, very detailed condition assessment of every single component of the building. Here, we're looking at things that are wrong with the building. And again, that's not been done before, but it makes a huge difference to what happens to that building, either for the retrofit design or the next kind of stage, the next stakeholder that takes on this report. So again, condition is something that will be maybe slightly unusual to many. Next slide. Occupancy. So for those of us long enough in the tooth to remember the Green Deal, the ill-fated Green Deal, we carried out an assessment there called the occupancy assessment, and it was actually quite a good data collection piece. We look at how people use the building, how many people are in the building, and things like that. This section provides an extension to that work. So looking at the levels and type of occupancy of the dwelling, special considerations, so vulnerable people, children, elderly, or those with disabilities, and also this formalized occupancy assessment, which again might affect the outcome of the energy performance calculation like it used to in the Green Deal, but also it might change some of the options that we put in place in the medium-term plan as well. So again, this is about making the retrofit suitable for the building and the people that live in the building. And again, if we forget these things, it's not going to end up in a good result for anyone. Next slide, please. Okay, ventilation. Ventilation is a key component of PAS 2035. It has to be considered really well in both the assessment and obviously the design and the works going forward. I think many people have been looking at ventilation as we've been carrying out retrofit assessments up to now, but I also know for a fact that many people haven't been looking at ventilation as closely as it should be. So we should be looking at extract systems in particular and whole house ventilation systems in accordance with BISRIA guidance. So there's a BISRIA guide, BG 46, which has been updated. And we should be looking at where there is ventilation in the building, what condition is it in, and is it working? So we can see fans, we can go anywhere and see fans, and we can even hear them spinning, and there might be a red LED flickering away there. But unless we carry out that specific measurement in line with BG 46, we're never going to know if that ventilation system is doing its job. Also, we talk here about things like trickle vents to allow that air to come in for it to be extracted through the fans. We need to talk about ventilation paths, undercuts on doors, purge ventilation, this, and this. Lots of many things. And also signs that ventilation isn't working. And that might come down to some of the occupancy work that we talked about in the previous slide. There are specific questions in there. Does the building feel stuffy? Do you feel that the building is ventilated? We can go on one day and it might be okay and the fan might be working, but there might be deeper things at work in that building that means it isn't very well ventilated, or that it's not ventilated in line with the occupancy, shall we say. So ventilation is a kind of key part of this puzzle. Next slide, please. So energy. I'm not going to labour the energy point, but that doesn't mean when we say energy that it's just go and do an EPC. That there are plenty of things that we've added to the retrofit assessment standard that extends that. So we talk about smart meters, we talk about availability of fuels on the site in the dwelling. We talk about circuits and rating of fuses and things like that, and main incoming breakers. We talk about any ancillary equipment, EV chargers, this, and this. batteries, PV. So a lot of this is covered in the EPC, but it's quite a big extension, and hopefully this is going to help the retrofit designer or other stakeholders to kind of make very specific judgments on the building without necessarily going straight back to it. So, you know, we need to really kind of focus on extending some of this work that we currently do. Next slide, please. So, significance. Again, I'm not going to labour significance because Joanne will talk about that in a few minutes. I put significance here with the icon of the castle. Okay, there's some sarcasm in this slide. But we're not going to be looking at castles, and really, we're not going to necessarily be looking at listed buildings for the vast majority of our time. But that's not to say that we're not going to find significant features and heritage features in the building. And we go into quite a bit of detail in the standard about how we can pick that kind of thing up. And that's something that the heritage people in the group have worked on a lot to make that process a little bit easier and to make it work better, I think. So, you know, we need to kind of consider significance, but I'm not going to dig deep on that. That's for Joanne to do. Okay, next slide, please. Reporting. I think reporting is a really key point of what we're doing here. And many of the team members have spent a lot of time designing what we call a kind of data schema. So this is a list, in essence, of all of the things that we need to collect. Now, that hasn't been done before for retrofit assessment. Many people have done it, but it's never been harmonized across accreditation schemes, across assessors, across projects and things like this. So we put a lot of time and effort, and it won't be perfect. That's why we're going out to consultation, and I want some good feedback on this. But basically, there's a whole section at the back of the document that says you shall collect this, 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 and this, and even gives examples of how you should collect it in terms of text, number, details, and things like that. So, you know, let's consider that this is going to help us, I think, more than anything else. There's also a section in there about drawings. I see huge variance in what drawings and photographs and things are being carried out for retrofit assessment reports. Some are great, some not so great. This we think is probably hit a middle ground in terms of being achievable, but without being too burdensome. Next slide, please. Qualifications. We're going to have to think. The accreditation schemes are going to have to think about what training has been carried out up to now. They're going to have to take a look at the document, and they're going to think about what upskilling might need doing. Okay, it's the same when we make huge changes to RDSAP. There'll be some CPD required. That's not for me to say. I'm not here to discuss that. The accreditation schemes will be the people who are going to work on that. But we've been working with the accreditation scheme, so that's not a big surprise. Next slide. So this is a brief overview. We complete it and it'll be published soon, hopefully May the 20th, I think is the day we're going for. We're going to want scrutiny through this consultation. There's a huge opportunity for high quality data here. We have no real assessment data in a harmonized structure in the UK. We think that when we use this data schema, we're going to be able to sit data next to EPCs and next to designs, and hopefully have more of a database type approach to the level of defects and mold and everything else that we find in these assessments. So we think this could be a big pivotal moment for retrofit. We hopefully help to minimize poor outcomes in retrofit. Next slide. So risks of retrofit. We usually open with the risks of retrofit, and I show you a load of disasters from Fishwick and places like this. To me, they are risky, and there is some risk in retrofit. But next slide. I think these are the main risks. So if we look at homes consuming about a third of the in the UK in terms of our CO2 emissions, if we look at this 2050 target, which will slowly be eroding away, then we need to improve about 29 million homes, and that number is open for debate. And the UK GBC say that about 1.8 homes a minute. Argue with those figures if you like, but the fact is we need to do a hell of a lot of retrofit in the UK to get somewhere anywhere near this target. Next slide. And to me, the main risk here is if we don't do this, people will continue to remain in fuel poverty. So in 2020, there were about 13% of households, 3 million more or less, in fuel poverty. People continue to die in cold homes. So 8,500 people died in England and Wales due to cold homes in 2020, and hazards that cost the NHS billions of pounds. Okay, if we look at them all together, that could hopefully be eliminated by good quality retrofit. Next slide. That's it. I'm done. Okay, so back to Colin.
Thanks very much, Richard. It's good to hear how the standard is going to systemize retrofit assessment and bring some commonality of approach. So I'd like to introduce now Joanne Williams, who's Risk and Regulations Heritage Surveyor, Historic England, who's going to give her take on how the standard will be used in.
Thanks, Colin. Can we go to the next slide then? So yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Joanne Williams. I work at Historic England. I'm a conservation accredited building surveyor, and before joining Historic England, I've worked on several different historic estates. As Richard said, like obviously I do work on castles, but actually I've also worked on over 140 let estate buildings that needed to comply with MEES regulations. I also supported obviously Andy and Richard, who you'll hear from today, on developing the standard, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview on how 40104 considers historic and traditional buildings. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So 40104, it's not attempting to be a comprehensive review on understanding designated or historic buildings, but it is seeking to ensure that assessors understand that working on a designated building requires a more considered approach, and that it's also to understand that there are additional legal responsibilities when working on a listed building, including other elements such as restricted covenants or easements, or even preservation orders in place. So 40104's core purpose is to ensure that all the information required is sourced and analysed to ensure that any proposals take account of all aspects of the building. It also seeks to improve the knowledge and understanding of the difference between traditional versus modern construction, whilst encouraging that we reuse our existing traditional buildings by recognising that they will have features that are of interest but can also potentially provide cohesion to their neighbouring buildings. So for those who work in the heritage sector, certain terms in this document do not wholly correlate with the terms used in the planning and legislation system. This is such as the term significance, but these are readily understood terms by those who have little or no experience in understanding, little or no experience of working on listed buildings. So the term isn't seeking to replace the meaning in the NPPF for designated buildings, but it's attempting to encourage those working on traditional buildings to recognise that they can contribute to the community's sense of place, and with nuanced approaches that they need to be retrofitted to make sure that they don't lead to damp, decay, and that blanket approaches aren't used. Can we go to the next slide? So it's really important that as an assessor that we recognise that all buildings were designed and constructed to combat the environmental exposure that the building would face. Our ancestors always made sure that they used materials that were local and readily available. And the importance of this is that understanding these materials would have actually already acclimatised themselves to their environment, so they were less likely to suffer from decay. Shamefully, now many people who work on buildings have actually forgotten this, and many traditionally constructed buildings have already been adapted with inappropriate materials that are leading to their decay. It's also important to recognise that the detailing and orientation of an existing building would have been intentional, and this would have been to mitigate any impact from the environment. So for example, this could be because we've got different depths of overhanging eaves, it could be the position or the amount of windows, and it could be whether the building was rendered or not. So whether you're working on a designated or undesignated building, understanding the historic construction details is important to understand the reason for why certain detailing was done in that way. This might be because a particular feature is aesthetically attractive, but more importantly, it's so that any design decisions don't prevent the building from being able to shed excess moisture or buffer any of the environmental conditions by unintentionally altering the building in a way that it wasn't originally designed. So for example, some historic timber frame buildings were actually originally rendered, and then at some point in their history, the render was removed. And this can actually have an impact on the timbers as it makes them colder and the timbers are exposed to likely environmental decays. You could say something similar to Victoria's terrace buildings. Now, a lot of those weren't originally rendered. So if we're going to be looking at doing external wall insulation onto these or rendering them in general, it's really important that we understand how the roof detailing might affect the insulation's principle. Because if it's not detailed correctly, we'll end up with water just seeping off the roof into the insulation. And then, as we all know, a wet wall is not going to be a warm wall. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is my last slide because it's quite a comprehensive one to go into, I suppose. No matter your position, it's really important that you recognise competence in yourself and not be afraid to say to someone that you don't know an area or that you need further support in it. There are a limited amount of surveyors, architects and structural engineers, and we've all sought to actually become specialists within the heritage sector. And we're able to provide support, information and assessments if you're working on a listed building. The importance of actually finding someone who's within these accreditation bodies is that we can actually limit unintended consequences on the buildings, and this will stop project delays from happening, and it will also stop delays if you're looking for consensual obligation. So in this standard, we have created a simplified assessment that is for non-designated buildings, and this is to be a guide of what should be considered when working on particularly those of traditionally constructed buildings. The guide is there purely to be a supporting thing to consider all elements of a building when undertaking an assessment. It's there to identify potential barriers and where more detailed design will be required to ensure that all appropriate design decisions can be made and considered prior to any works being undertaken. That's me done. Thank you. So I look forward to your questions. Colin?
Hi, thanks, Joanne. Thanks for your insights on the retrofit narrative sector. So I'd now like to introduce Andrew Parkin, who's the Director at Elmhurst Energy and Chair of the Property Energy Professional Association, who is going to give us his take on managing compliance with the new standard. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Colin, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, next slide, please. Let's get into it. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about managing compliance, which invariably means some discussions around quality assurance. So we'll get into that in a second. But let's, if we click on to the next slide, please, let's just set the scene of where we are. So going back to what Peter was talking about earlier, which is each home counts and a bit of a history lesson. There is another recommendation. I think there were 17 or 16 in total, and this is one of the latter ones, which is all about how we can create or how we need to create a robust and joined up industry-wide compliance and enforcement regime. Looking at things like on-site auditing, looking at random auditing, risk-based approaches. So these are all things that either already exist within parts of the industry or have been created in sort of the interim period since each home counts. But it's worth having that as a starting point, because we'll cover some of these as we go along. If we can go to the next slide, please. Again, just looking back, so past 2035, as we've mentioned, came out in 2019, created 3 roles, one of which was retrofit assessor. I think we had advisor in there at one point, but that sort of got absorbed into the other roles, which are coordinator and installer. We've also got designer in there as well, but I talk about 3 main roles and how they sort of interact with each other. So I think the crux of all of this was that the PAS had a dedicated section, clause 7, past 2035, and that was detailed enough for us to start the process, but it wasn't comprehensive. And there were plenty of areas where, plenty of shades of grey, or areas where we perhaps could interpret things differently. That's fine from a starting point, but obviously we needed some work on how we can standardize things across the industry. And there was obviously this provision in place to say that at some point we have a dedicated standard for retrofit assessor, and fast forward sort of 4 years or so, maybe even longer than that now, here we are with a standard in draft format. If we move on to the next slide, please. So in that interim period, we had to do something as an industry. We couldn't just kind of roll along and hope for the best. So colleagues at Pepper, with Trustmark as well, and another number of other key industry stakeholders, got together and we created a bit of a working group around retrofit assessor and retrofit coordinator. So the two new roles that that needed to be, I suppose, brought into clarity. So we took the current clause, the clause that existed in PAS 2035, which was clause 7, went through it line by line and looked at what it was asking for. And then we looked at what was already on the shelf, from whether that's methodology, software, quality assurance procedures, etc., and tried to fit it into what PAS was asking for, but also thinking as schemes and other industry stakeholders, what we needed to do in order to get this whole thing rolling and moving forwards in the right way. So we created something called the scheme requirements document, and it still exists today. I think it's in the 4th version of it, and it is publicly available. That link you probably won't be able to click on right now, but we'll make that available post session. But it is easy to find on the Trustmark website as well. And that document took about 6 months or so to get into version 1. And effectively became our scheme operating requirements. Anybody who knows anything about energy performance certificates and the scheme requirements document there, we borrowed heavily from that style of framework. And so all the major sections that were in there are very, very similar to the way that energy performance of buildings regulations, scheme operating requirements works. As I say, it was the schemes working with Trustmark. We effectively created terms of reference for that working group. In essence, the Trustmark acts a bit like the government and has a bit of a casting or golden vote, and all the schemes sit down and try and find a way that we can all work together in a standardized way, and then we try and reflect that in the document. We did a bit of a gap analysis on what the current competencies that were allowed within PAS 2035, things like DEA, SAP assessor, etc., where the gaps existed between that and the PAS, and we created actively a list of things that needed to be covered off within either an upskill or a qualification. And we also looked at what they also needed to provide in terms of quality assurance as well, anything in addition to what already is on the shelf. So we looked at what a quality assurance regime needed to be, and what the assessor needed to provide to be involved in that. We also looked at things like continued professional development, and there are some variations between the way that perhaps a DEA, for example, would work and the way a retrofit assessor would work. But in essence, they layer each other, so you have to have DEA as a sort of a minimum, and retrofit assessor sits on top of that. And there's some significance there, because what we wanted to do is, if somebody was a practicing DEA, for example, but lost that accreditation for some reason, we didn't want them carrying on with as a retrofit assessor. I think the reasons for that are pretty fairly obvious. If we move on to the next slide, please. We also started to look at what they need to do as sort of as a minimum, what we needed as a minimum from an assessor in order to be considered competent and accredited. So yes, we need to have competence. We needed to look at what that competence actually meant, and actually competence is quite a complicated thing, and certainly as we move forwards, there's a lot of people who could be competent in order to be retrofit assessors, and we needed to reflect that diversity. We also looked at what accreditation involved as well, any sort of variances there between what has gone before and what we needed for retrofit assessor. but there was that sort of core requirement that an assessor must be both competent and accredited in order to practice. And we also we looked at things like assessors being independent of the installer. They need to be technology agnostic. How do we deal with those sort of conflicts or challenges within the industry? And we also needed to ensure that the assessment was done sort of as an independent action and done outside of the PAS. Now, when we're looking at this standard, all of those things are now in there. It's sort of core objectives of the standard. And we often talk about how this is going to be implemented into the PAS. I actually think, I know colleagues agree with me, and it was sort of a major thrust of this. This is a standard that can sit alone. It can be part of PAS, but it can be used as a standard and plugged into something else at another time, and actually be used as an assessor to produce an assessment. I actually think having a retrofit assessment done at the bequest of a homeowner and a medium-term improvement plan produced and given to that homeowner is a really good outcome, because that homeowner can decide when and where and how they start to retrofit their property. Hopefully they go into a PAS 2035 process, but equally they can use that, hold that, and do something with it later on. So I think they're the sorts of things we explored throughout this process. If we just move on to the next slide, please. So we've started thinking about our compliance requirements, and this is something that we're going to have to do as the standard is finalised. We get outside of the draft process and through the consultation process. Hopefully we get some really great feedback, which allows us to start moving forward from a compliance point of view. But clearly all the schemes and other stakeholders will have to get back around the table again, reform that working group, and take what we have and move it forward. We all agree that it's an evidence-based assessment. There are different ways of gathering that evidence, obviously. We've already heard from Richard earlier about the context piece being so important. Some of that can be done prior to, and some of it can be done on site. So it's a combination of evidence that's going to be gathered. But clearly there has to be a site assessment done. That's not to say there isn't site assessment being done at the moment, but just for clarity, we're not trying to move away from a site assessment. In fact, we're trying to enhance that aspect of it. The key thing for me is that this standard contains a data set. Richard alluded to it earlier, and I think it's so important. Some of the challenges that we face at the moment is because, and I can understand why we are where we are, but we do find that assessment is being done differently by different assessors using different software tools and through different schemes, and we need to sort of bring that back together. So this schema, not quite the right word, but a data set that has been standardized and agreed and is going to be used across the board will be exceptionally helpful. Number one, it will help the assessor do a good job every time. It'll help them understand what data and what evidence needs to be produced, required of other parts in the process, the retrofit process, and also as schemes and as quality assurance practitioners, we have to be able to say with confidence what we're going to get back in, and therefore we can build our processes around it, and we can have similar or the same processes across the board. So that all starts with the data set itself. And we also need to know exactly what we're going to get in terms of documentary evidence as well. I think things like floor plans, electronic floor plans being one of the aspects, things that are noted down in the site notes. We're not having to second guess or chase for information. I think will be really, really helpful in terms of a speedy process, but also a high quality process. And also that data will be interoperable. We aim for. Why is that important? Well, it just means that it can be looked at anybody by anybody at any time and understood. It can be, for me, a start of a journey, which means that you take an assessment and then you do something to the building and then you update that data. That then goes back into the pot and it's can be used again and again and again. And I think without doing that, we are always in a situation where an assessment is starting from zero. When you start from zero, you're very much dependent on what's available at the time. of assessment. I've been an energy assessor for a very long time, and I know how frustrating it is for me going to site and I haven't got enough evidence when I think something has been installed, or there's insulation in an area, but I have no evidence. If we can get to a stage where the data set and the evidence is interoperable and accessible, wonderful, because we can start to be consistent then, and consistency is key. I don't want to have to draw a floor plan for the umpteenth time when somebody else has drawn it. I just want to be able to look at it, check it, make sure it's right, add to it if it needs adding to. And again, just coming back to that point around consistency of QA process, I think is so important, because we can really get to the nub of some of the issues that happen within almost any process, but particularly around retrofit. We want to be able to look at trends. We want to be able to understand sort of risks. We want to do proper risk-based auditing, and smarter auditing as well. We started doing smart auditing for EPCs for all the different schemes, but particularly for DEA, and it was a bit of a game changer. We could look at things in a profile, look at higher risks versus lower risks. We could look at trends, and I think being able to do that within retrofit will be hugely beneficial. If we move on to the next slide, please. I think this is my final slide. As I mentioned already, that smart auditing, risk-based auditing is hugely important, and being able to correct any errors quickly and effectively as well. So what we don't want to do is find that an assessment has been lodged through the process, and several months later we are going back in and finding errors and having them corrected, and it's too late. We need to be able to do this much more quickly, and again, the data is so important with that. We also want to be able to do more risk-based follow-on. So if we find an issue, we want to understand if it's an issue wider or with that assessor, or whether that's a trend for that assessor, and then we want to be able to look at more targeted and more effective follow-on auditing. The challenge we have is an assessor can be lodging in different places at different times, and it's very hard to keep our arms around that. And we also want to make sure that whenever there are sanctions, and there are sanctions for assessors, that they are appropriate. We all apply the same sorts of sanctions, and we can do that in the right way. We start at a level, and if we find further issues, we can move the scales and make sure that the sanctions are appropriate. And again, we've aimed to do that as we built this scheme operating requirements document, but we want to enhance that as we build with this new standard in mind. One thing that's really useful, and it exists at the moment and will continue to be so, is, and I don't know if enough people are aware of this, but when there is a sanction against a retrofit assessor, just like if there's a sanction against an energy assessor, all the schemes do communicate with each other. And if someone were to lose their status to practice for whatever reason, some people call it striking off, some people call it revocation, but whatever the term is, if somebody is prevented from working in the industry on a permanent basis, all the schemes are duty bound to match that status, so somebody can't go from one scheme to another and carry on practicing. It's very well policed within the EPBD schemes, DEA, SAP, etc., and we want to ensure that that is very similarly policed within retrofit. And I think again the standard will help us in that endeavour, and just enhance what we already have at the moment. And I think that's my last slide. So very much looking forward to questions, and yeah, I hope that was very helpful. Back to you, Colin. Colin, we can't hear you at the moment, I'm afraid.
There we go. Just a bit of a user technology interface problem there. Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. Thanks for giving us that overview and the very systematic way that you're approaching managing compliance. So yes, we now have a panel Q&A. So if I could ask you all to switch, all the speakers to switch their mics and cameras back on, that would be great. Okay, I think we've got everybody.
No, Richard's not there. Here
Yeah,
he
we
is.
have Richard now. That's great. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much to you all for giving, you know, first of all, Peter, an overview of the framework, and then each of you giving, you know, specific input on the new standard. We have quite a few questions, some of which I think probably are going to have to be answered by me here at BSI. There are questions on quite a lot of questions on PAS 2035 and how this standard will fit in with PAS 2035, and when that's likely to happen, that the standard will become normatively referenced in the PAS. We're looking to have the new edition of PAS 2035 mid 2025, and we expect, although obviously it will be a matter for the consensus building process in the development of the PAS, but we very much expect that BS 40104 will replace the requirements of Clause 7 in PAS 2035, as Andy alluded to. And so one of the questions around that is, PAS 2035 is mandated in publicly funded work, although we need to emphasize that anyone can use PAS 2035. It's not only for use in publicly funded work. But Peter, the question is, once BS 40104 is called up in PAS 2035, then compliance with BS 40104 will be mandatory if compliance with PAS 2035 is mandatory. Is that correct?
Yes, I think a couple of things have to happen. We have to publish 40104, as you said, but we also have to make the amendments to PAS 2035. And actually, it could be as simple as saying, if you don't want to use Clause 7, you can use BS 40104. That would be the easiest and simplest amendment. Or the more likely amendment, I think, is that we'll take out Clause 7 of PAS 2035 and say you must now use BS 40104 for retrofit assessments. Either way round, we'll get there, but it is controlled really by the process of amendment. As you said, PAS 2035 is on a biannual update, so the earliest we could probably get to that point is sometime in 2025. However, a very quick amendment rather than update to PAS 2035 might allow us, by inserting one sentence, to say if you don't want to use Clause 7, you can use 40104 as soon as it's published. So we could get there a little bit quicker. Either way, I think we will end up with a situation where 40104 is the mandatory standard in publicly funded schemes for the assessment process. So we will eventually drop what's now Clause 7 of PAS 2035.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I think the next one would be either for you, Andy, or Richard. Andy, you spoke quite a lot about the data sets in the schema in BS 40104. There's a question, if you could maybe revisit that and say what the key data sets will be.
Yeah, obviously the data set will be dictated by what you see on site. I know it sounds a little bit trite, but the key areas that Richard covered are effectively sections within the data set. So compliance, energy, historical significance where applicable. They're all data sets, individual sections, and within those sections we've gone through the standard and looking for what those questions should be, how they should be phrased, and in essence, what are the options? We can't cover every option. And I know Rich and I sat down together for more hours than we can probably remember now, but going through and trying to figure out how best to do that. I think what Rich has said is absolutely right. That's not our first version of it. It's gone through quite a few iterative changes, but it is our first version that people will see. And we are looking for feedback on that, because there's quite a bit there, as you'd appreciate. Retrofit assessment it's quite complicated on a lot of buildings. There's an awful lot of information to gather, and therefore, we need to make sure that when it is gathered, it is in a standard format, and that where we can take that format and create things like software applications out of the back of it. And those applications do broadly the same thing in terms of the output files that they produce. Does that make sense? And Richard, anything you want to add to that?
No, I just it's a lot more detailed than what we currently have, and it will be, you know, if all of our cards are on the table here, it will be, you know, quite a lengthy assessment. However, it's what is needed. There will be a standard kind of minimum data set, but I don't think we're ever going to stop anyone adding what they want to that as well. But I think probably I'd see it as a minimum rather than a maximum, I think is fair to say. Yeah.
Rich, you said something quite interesting when we've chatted about it. It's not a 10-minute job, but it's not a 4-hour job either. But it's got to be right, hasn't it? I think the skill will come is taking that data set and producing software that will make that data collection process as effective as possible.
And also just add to that, it depends what the project is as well, of course. You know, if it's a very specific project maybe in a very specific part of the UK or something, for instance, working on these archetypal houses, then there might be added things on it. But yeah, it's semi-flexible, I guess, is the way I would look at it.
Thank you both. Obviously, as you just said, it's going to make a big difference in the reporting. I think you mentioned the reporting, Richard, in your presentation. I think you probably covered it in the presentation, Richard. But there are some questions. There are a few questions asking, why do we need BS 40104 when we already have past 2035? But I think we've made that fairly evident. But would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I think I can. I think if you were to do a straw poll of 50 retrofit assessments, you would find that they had quite a high degree of variation. And I think the only way to standardize these things is to provide a standard and to defend that. And I'm looking to Peter to help with this. Is I think that the assessment process is the backbone of the design process. You know, how can we get this right if we don't know what is happening at the houses? And even how can we know how much the homes have improved if we don't know what the state of the houses were, which funders might start to ask us for as well. Peter, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think assessment is absolutely vital, and I've for a long time campaigned for assessment to be done separately in government programs from the actual delivery of retrofit. Nobody in DESNA is actually listening to that, but I think it's the way we have to go, because assessment does two things. It raises the expectations of the householders and the landlords about what could happen to their homes, how they could be improved, and it also plots out a kind of a map of future work for the industry. So we can see from the assessments that have been done what work is out there. So splitting the two, which was originally proposed by other people long before we even did each home counts, it seems to me the right way to go. And so separating the assessment process out of the bigger standard also seems to me to be a really good move, which will support that change in due course.
Yeah, I agree. I've campaigned for a long time for the EPC to have some kind of element of condition in it. I seem to be getting nowhere with that. But the idea of developing recommendations for people, given that you might have seen mold and condensation in a building, kind of goes against what I certainly do as a day-to-day anyway. So yeah, I think it's a good thing, but it needs to be standardized. Yes.
And what it'll do is it'll put the recommendations on a much sounder footing than we have them at the moment. The recommendations at EPCs at the moment are dreadful, but we will be able to do a much more sound process of recommendation.
Okay, thank you both. Now, Joanne, we have had some questions around retrofit in the heritage sector, and this one's a little long-winded, but I'll put it your way. We are currently having issues installing heat pumps into traditional buildings, as the funding guidance requires wall insulations to be installed. Experience tells us heat pumps can work well in traditional buildings without wall insulation, as the walls will act as thermal mass. will this be considered in the standard?
I get this question quite a lot actually, because we're always discussing, can heat pumps go into older buildings? Yes, they can. There is a lot of evidence that's come out from both Historic England, SIBSE, and DESNZ on this. But regarding this standard specifically, obviously this isn't a design standard, it's an assessment standard. So I think it's really important that actually the point of this is you understand the building, its construction, and actually identify, is it modern or traditional? Is it going to need insulation or not? Like a cob building isn't going to need insulation, but it can facilitate a heat pump. So the whole core point of it is, let's get this assessment correct, let's get the information there, let's get it over to the designer to make sure that things are appropriately designed and considered so that we don't cause decay, whether you're working on a traditional or historic building or a modern one.
Thank you. So the standards for assessment, not for design. But yeah.
Yeah,
in short.
Thanks
so
very
Colin,
much.
can I just jump in on that
Sure.
piece there? So obviously, if you look at the energy section within the standard, we explore that there are different methodologies at play. You can utilize different methodologies. If you look at the domestic energy assessment methodology, RDSAT, that's a whole house assessment, but there are methodologies out there that allow you to go room by room, and that would be more appropriate for the purposes of looking specifically at a heating system change. You need to understand the heat flows and the heat losses on a room by room basis, and so therefore you can flex when you can bring in other things if you want. This is a minimum standard, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Sure. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually take issue with the questioner slightly. The reason for reducing the demand of the building before you put the heat pump in is because if you don't, even if you can make the heat pump do the job of heating the home, it will be more expensive. So what we need to do is reduce the demand to make it possible to heat the homes with what's essentially renewable energy, decarbonized energy from wind power into the grid, without putting people's fuel costs up. And people absolutely don't need their fuel costs putting up at the current time. So that's why that guidance says that, and it applies to all buildings, not just traditionally constructed ones. And I would very much stand by the need to look at the fabric as well as the heat pump. There's a kind of school of thought in DESNZ at the moment that's saying to ministers, we can just do net zero carbon by 2050 by converting everything to heat pumps and decarbonizing the grid. And yeah, you can, but at a very high cost to the consumer. So we need to just bear that in mind, I think, as we move forward.
Okay, fabric first.
Absolutely. Joanne's saying no.
Whole house approach, not fabric.
Yes,
right.
absolutely.
Please make sure it's considered fabric interventions, not just let's bosh out and do that.
That's what you get for having an amateur sloganizing. Yes. Okay, there were quite a few questions around, I think, maybe for you, Andy, or for anyone really, around competence and the qualifications of assessors. So if I can find one that. So this question is, what additional training is expected to be required for qualified retrofit assessors working under the different schemes to demonstrate that they are proficient to deliver surveys under this new standard?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's not a short answer, and I'll try and keep it short. Rich may come in and step in and say, Andy, stop talking. We already have practicing retrofit assessors, and they will have gone through probably a number of different routes. So we need to understand that and try and do the right thing by those that are currently practicing. Clearly, there are areas here that won't have been covered by any of the training that exists at the moment. So we've got to pick that up and pull that in some way and do the right job. And that will be down to the schemes and other stakeholders to be involved in that conversation. If you are to look at this as a sort of a fresh pair of eyes or new entrants, then that's a slightly different place to be. And we are aware that there are a number of qualifications out there, and there are a number of competencies out there that will be applicable. So chartered surveyors may wish to and probably already are involved in retrofit, what does that really mean? Do they have all the competency required to do the job, or do they need to have some form of bolt-on or upskill in some way? So I think it's about looking at all angles here and not being restrictive on new entrants or existing practitioners, and finding the right way of moving forward with it. But clearly there are gaps and we need to address those gaps. Anything from you, Rich?
Yeah, there is. So I think if we look at the past 2035 sector, anything else outside that is a different thing. But what I would say is that Andrew represents Pepper, which sit over all of the accreditation schemes. And we've briefed all the accreditation schemes at a meeting before we started developing this standard, way back when. And everyone was in agreement that this standard needs writing, and everyone was also in agreement, and hopefully this will work through Pepper, is that this will be harmonised. What I don't want to see is one accreditation scheme doing it different. Otherwise, we've lost what we started to do. So that is why Andy is here, to take that Pepper view to roll it out across all of the accreditation schemes. So just to reinforce that, really, that it will be harmonised, and as such, not only the assessment but the qualifications, the competencies. We don't write the qualification, okay, but what is in the back of the standard is a list of things that we think are competencies that an assessor would need. Okay, that is then for the accreditation schemes, awarding bodies, whoever. Now the important thing is that didn't exist until this standard. So we've created that. So there's only so much we can do, and Colin, I'm sure, will back me up that we don't, as standards writers, write exams or qualifications. That's for someone else to do.
No, I can confirm that. Thanks very much to you all. We're coming to the end of time now, so perhaps I don't know if just in the last few minutes, if there's perhaps each of you maybe has one key thing you think you'd like to say about the standard and how it's going to improve, the methodology, systemizing, commonality in retrofit assessment. We'll start with you, Rich. Oh.
So.
Okay. Yeah, start with you, Rich. I'll come to collision remarks in a bit. Yeah.
I've already said how I think it can improve it. I would use this 10 seconds just to ensure that everyone on the call kind of takes a look at it and gives feedback. There's 12 of us, okay? There's 172 of you. And I would like to see comment. I've taken part in consultations in the past. Yes, they're a bit of a pain, but you've got to do it. That's your kind of duty as industry professionals, is to tell us if it's right or wrong. And as chair, I can guarantee that it will all be read and considered. You have my word on that. And the panel, I think I can speak for all of them when I say that this is what we think, and we've tried to pitch it in the best possible way, but we do need some feedback. Okay. Thanks,
Rich. Andy?
Yeah, just to echo those points from Rich, really. And consultations don't mean, responding to consultations doesn't mean you have to answer every question. You can hone in on those specific areas where you're an expert or you have a strong opinion, and leave the rest. So just have that in the back of your mind. You don't have to dedicate 20 days to replying to a consultation. 20 minutes is as good. And yeah, for me, it's about an opportunity to standardize, as Richard has just mentioned, around qualification and competency, but also sort of data sets, and how the reports are put together. I think that's so important.
Thanks, Andy. Peter?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say something strategic that actually came from Colin King about 3 or 4 years ago. He said, we've got past 2035, but that's not the end of the story, it's the beginning. We're going to continue to introduce more and more standards to do with different aspects of retrofit, and they will replace more and more bits of past 2035. So, it's a good idea for people to keep in mind that we are going to get better at this. And as we get better at this, we will build in that new expertise into new standards. It's a learning process for all of us. Retrofit's all about new materials, new products, new processes, and doing things in people's houses that we've never done before. So we need to learn and then build the standards, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Thanks, Peter. And Joanne.
How do you want me to follow Peter? That was so eloquent. I'd just reinforce basically what all three of them have already said before me, but I'd also say, I think it is that collaboration piece, and actually I've learned so much and been so grateful to the other people that sat in the standards with me, because coming at it from a historic point of view with just traditional knowledge is very different to those working the modern. And I think actually as a group, I think we all learned quite a lot from one another, and I'd say as a sector, this is what we should be continuing to do, is we should be working together to make, construction and the UK a better building stock. So yeah, I look forward to people's comments.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that accolade for the standards making process. That's great, Joanne. Thanks. And the message from BSI, it echoes what the speakers have said. Please comment. Someone asked that the dates on the link are not quite the same as those I mentioned. That's just a bit of a database update issue here, but we're expecting consultation to open in May and finish in July. So please go back to the link and comment, as everyone said. So I'll just say a big thank you again to all our speakers, Joanne, Peter, Andrew, and Richard. And please keep in touch, please comment, and thanks for attending.